All right, everybody. So this is a little tutorial on some basics regarding supply and demand, or demand and supply, because that's kind of the order that we do them in. Let me just get this set up. So a couple of things. I know there's some great videos out there that Mr. Clifford has to offer, and those are great. You should use them. And this is just a little something different that I thought would be helpful if you were absent, or if you felt like you left class today or yesterday, whatever day it was, and you felt a little bit of loss. So there's three things I'm going to talk about in this video: the concept of individual versus market, demand and supply, the language that we use to refer to these, and that includes both how we write about demand and supply and how we speak about it, and then lastly, how we label and draw these. So first of all, after having read Chapter 3 and done your work on your Chapter 3 Connect, I don't think I'm telling you anything that's brand new information, but individual demand and individual supply are based upon the fact that every person or every shop or every firm, the amount that they demand or supply is going to be contingent upon the price of the item. So I'm using demand here as a demonstration. If the item, let's say an apple, for example, is $4, there would be less of that product demanded at that price. So I think that demand is really easy to start with because it's very logical. We go through our lives demanding things all the time as consumers. So demand is something that's really easy to wrap our heads around in the beginning. Supply, I feel, is a little more difficult because we're not used to running a business. But ultimately, I want you to use your life experience and logic to understand that obviously if something declines in price, more of it is going to be demanded. And for this reason, demand is known as an inverse relationship, whereas supply is known as a direct relationship. So the opposite is true for supply. So if an item costs more money, therefore the business will be able to supply more of that item because they have to buy more land, labor, and capital to produce that item. So for instance, take yourself back to the econo game. Businesses would be able to supply more econos if they could charge more money. This will enable them to purchase more land, labor, and capital, and therefore they would be able to supply, let's say, 4 econos if they can charge, let's say, 4 econos goes down here, and if they were able to charge, let's say, $300 per an econo, as opposed to $100 for an econo, which they're only going to be able to supply about 1. Because remember, they had to buy a capital resource, a natural resource, and a human. So in order to buy these 3 things to turn them into an econo, you needed money. So if you don't have money, you can't make the product that you're trying to sell. So let's get back to this individual versus market thing. So individuals, one person, one demand. Think of the business owners in the econo game. Think of the households. The cheaper the econos are, the more they can buy. The more expensive the econos are, the more they can supply. They can buy the land, labor, capital. The market is a little different. Market is about things that impact the demand or the supply of an item that is not related directly to price. So these are things that are, again, not related directly to price. So for example, if this is a demand curve for the market for apples, if all of a sudden there's an article that's released in like the New York Times covering a study that, the New England Journal of Medicine did, so, reputable organizations studying the impact of apples upon people's health. If there was a research article or a study that said consuming an apple a day really does keep the doctor away, and that people who eat at least 1 apple a day can elongate their life by 15 years, there's going to be an increase in the demand for apples simply because people expect to live longer lives if they consume the apples. Now, let's say the opposite happened. Let's say something like the article says apples can lead to blindness. Then you're going to see a large amount of people start to say, hey, I don't want to buy an apple because I don't want to be blind. I don't care how cheap it is. So apples could be a penny each, and people would say, no way, man, I'm not buying an apple. So when we talk about the market demand, we're talking about things that influence the demand for a product. Or if we talk about the market supply, it's the same. It's things that influence the supply that don't have anything to do with the price of the item. And also this is having to do with demand. All right. So that's the difference between market and individual. And when we talk about these things, the language we use is really important. So I'm just going to underline these for emphasis here. When we're talking about individual demand, we're plotting points on the line, and we're going to say the word. The quantity demanded at $1 is 4, whereas the quantity demanded at $3 is 2. Whereas if we're talking about the scenarios regarding the health impact of an apple, we're going to say the demand increased or the demand decreased. We're not going to say over here, when the price goes from $3 to $1, the demand increased, because that language actually implies the shift to the right. So you just have to be careful with the language. I know it's kind of annoying, but words matter. Lastly, let's talk about labeling. So I just did what I call 2 generic supply and demand graphs down here at the bottom. So no matter what we're doing, if we're doing supply and demand, we're going to do price and quantity here. We're going to have our upward sloping supply curve, our downward sloping demand. I know that the curves, when you look in the textbook, are like these beautiful limits where they like hug the axes, and like you're more than welcome to do that, but I find that graphing them is just so much easier and neater if we just do straight lines. And that's what you're going to see on a lot of the printed materials in books and on worksheets. Okay, so if we're going to shift the demand or the supply in a market sense, that's what we're going to do most of the time. We're going to shift the entire line, just like we did up here with the demand scenario for apples. You guys know from chapter 3 where these two things intersect is called 2 things. It could be called the market price. So that's one language, or it can be called the equilibrium price. We're going to say equilibrium price most often in our class, but don't forget that market price is something that it's called. So to indicate that on the graph, I'm going to do a capital P because it's price, and I'm going to put the equilibrium. I'm going to do a capital Q for the quantity, and we're going to call that QE. So we're using little subscripts. If the demand increases, we're going to shift the line to the right. If it decreases, we're going to shift it to the left. So how you do this is you just try to shift it on a parallel plane. You're going to call the new line D1. You're going to do that little bullet point where they intersect. You're going to do new dotted lines, and I'm going to call this Q1 so the subscript matches the new line. And then I'm going to do some dotted lines over here and P1. And there I go. I have shown an increase in demand. And let's not forget just 2 arrows. The College Board requires what they call directional changes, which is code for saying, please put arrows showing us which way your line is moving. So to show you a decrease in demand, we're also going to do those arrows to the left. I would do that parallel plane over there. I'm just going to call this D2 since it's the second one I drew. I'm going to do a little line going down, Q2, P2. All right, so there's your demand changes. Let's flip over to supply. Supply is tough for a couple of reasons, and mainly it's because of the way it looks. So a supply increase is the same as a demand increase. So if the supply of, let's say, apples increased because of new technology that enabled farmers to take the apples off of the trees in a more efficient manner, that shifter would be called technology, and we would see the supply line shift to the right. Now, what is hard for kids initially on this is that they think because supply went up, they should move the line up. So visually, up is here, but that's actually to the left on the number line. So when you shift supply to the left, just like demand, you're showing a decrease. But kids often think that this is up is an increase, and this is what it looks like because your whole life up is up. So the language we use is important. So it's really important that you use the words increase and decrease as opposed to up and down, and that you do your arrows on horizontal planes. See how I did these horizontally? What I did not do is I did not do something like this. I'm going to use my scrap paper here because I don't want to make my drawing different. What I didn't do is something like that to show an increase in supply, because that's super confusing for your brain. Your whole life, an arrow that looks like that means down, and you associate the word down with decrease. So this is just my experience in the last, 16 years of my life teaching supply and demand, and just trying to pass over those common mistakes to you so that way you can skip them and just start correct from the beginning. So put your arrows on horizontal planes, say the words increase and decrease instead of up and down. That's really going to help you with supply. All right. So those are basics about supply and demand. It's going to help you if you missed class or if you need to hear it again. And good luck with all your practice.